My name is Bruno Waterfield. I'm the Brussels correspondent for the Times of London newspaper. I have been coming to the Battle of Ideas since it began, and last year I chaired a debate organised by the Battle of Ideas and also Young Arab Voices on the Arab Spring. It was a really good debate. I'm really hoping that today's debate will be anything like as good. This debate has been co-organised with Young Arab Voices, which is funded by the Anna Lint Foundation, British Council, and is a very worthy enterprise because it's basically organised around debate and advocacy that is led by young people from the Arab world. Now, this is a really interesting discussion. There's a whole discussion about resisting radicalisation. And what I want to try and do in this discussion, and what I think and I hope our speakers will be doing, and what I hope the audience as well will be doing, is to try and unpack this discussion, to try and challenge some of the assumptions that lie behind it. I mean, is radicalisation, is being radical always so bad? Is it really a bad thing to want and to search out new ideas? Is it really a bad thing to challenge the status quo? Is it not really surprising when David Cameron, the Prime Minister, tells us that ISIS, Islamic State, are the biggest threat to Western civilization? Is it not surprising that people want to find out more? Is he not propagandizing for Islamic State? Why is it that when we are concerned about radicalisation, that we manifest that, or it's manifested particularly by the state, in terms of suspicion, and it's suspicion of a particular group of people, it's a suspicion particularly of young Muslims. And if we think of the case of Ahmad in America, the boy who famously took his clock to school in Texas, we can see the level of suspicion that surrounds the intellectual endeavours of young Muslims, in this case a science project. What better way to build a sense of grievance than by treating with hostility and suspicion the intellectual struggles of young people to find their place in the world, to find a sense of meaning and belonging. So that's just me trying to frame the debate a little bit and to try and, set out how I would like to think about sort of challenging perhaps some of the assumptions behind this. Now, we've got a good panel, and they are going to speak for around about 5 minutes. Well, it will be no more than 5 minutes, because I will hold up this red card and they will stop and we'll move on to the next speaker. And then we might just clarify a couple of things up here on this table, and then we'll go out to the audience. So I'll introduce the speakers in the order in which they are speaking. First of all, Samar Mezgheni. She is a Tunisian writer. She's half Iraqi. She's written 14 children's books, hundreds of short stories. She's quite well known in the region. And she's currently doing a PhD at Cambridge on the depiction of Muslims in the media. So she'll kick off the debate in a minute. Then we'll be hearing from Hamad. He's Jordanian Finnish. He speaks 5 languages: English, Finnish, Swedish, German and Arabic. He's Secretary of International Relations at the University of Vasa in Finland. His particular areas of interest are education, and he's been doing volunteering work in a refugee camp. After Ahmad, we'll be hearing from Saja Elgredly. Now, she is Egyptian. She's just finished a postgrad course in international communications and development at City University, and she's a community activist. She does lots of volunteering and work along lines of women's rights, and she's a community activist in Egypt. Our final speaker, last but not least, is Anas Darkwawi, who is originally from Syria. He's a veteran of Young Arab Voices. He works for the Asfari Foundation as a programme manager, and that's a British charity that works with communities in Syria, Lebanon and Palestine. He's got a background in youth programs, so it's a good panel. We're going to frame the discussion, and then we're going to have what I hope will be a good debate with you, the audience. So first of all, Samar.
I'd like to start with a story, actually, of an encounter I had with a radical group. In fact, here in the UK. So I was on a train in Birmingham, and I met this group of young men who were very, very violent. They were sitting together, supportive of each other, and they seemed like they were plotting something. I was very scared because they looked irritated by everyone else around them and rejecting everyone else, especially those that had different opinions than theirs in the train, and I will explain more. But more of all, I felt worried about my own safety from this radical group. So I tried to listen more to what they were saying and figure out what their intentions are. And they turned out to be a very, very radical group who are fans of a sport club. Now, these fans of sport clubs, they didn't express any religious ideas or any of the sort in the train, but they did stop anyone who did not support their fan club from entering the train. They also seemed very hostile of those who were not talking about football. So I was one of these people who were just using the train for commuting, and I had absolutely no idea what their club is. So I really had to be silent and watch for my safety. Now, what struck me the most is that when I came back home after having a very risky situation, I felt, where I couldn't really, just have a safe ride back home, what struck me the most and what was really astonishing for me is that there was no mention of them on the news. No one calls them a radical group. They are not called a threat to the security of people, at least on a daily life. And no one is trying to fight them. They're just a radical group who is allowed to live here and threaten people's safety. The reason why I'm telling you the story is that I'm trying to open up the debate and open up the definitions of what radical groups are. Because the debate has been centered towards one group and one religion. And we forget sometimes that radicalization can be felt from can be seen and observed in other groups. So, for example, I fear a lot radical conservatives in the West that, if anything, they do fool other radicalized group, which then fool them, and it's just a continuous circle of self-fulfilling proficiency where you expect people to be radical, so because of those expectations, they become radical, and then the more radical they are, the more your expectations are being met, which then obviously give them an excuse to be even more radical. But what we do forget sometimes about radical groups, and this is again an attempt to open the debate a bit and be maybe a little creative about it, what we do forget about them is that these are people who, besides their actions that are violent and that we are against, we forget to talk about the causes, and we narrow the causes. And one of the causes that I think is very important to focus on and shed some light on is inequality. And radical groups actually in my region, in the Arab world and also in the West, have been fighting inequality in one way or another, but instead of articulating and when I say inequality, I mean gender equality, I mean socioeconomic inequality, I also mean race inequality, I mean inequalities in many ways that is sometimes institutionalized, but other times even settle in our everyday experiences. So these people, I feel, even when they are being radicalized and even when they are expressing themselves in violent terms, they are standing for important causes that sometimes pass absent from our minds or pass unobserved. And it is in a way their fault for not articulating them in ways that can be attractive to, the regular guy who's not radical. Just to finish, I feel that we need to remember that radical groups, whether it's the sport fans maybe, or the Islamists, or the conservatives, or whatever radical group you can think of, are also people who sometimes have brilliant ideas and try to promote or at least fight causes of inequality and of injustice. But instead of putting it in a constructive way, they opt for the destructive message. Thank you.
Okay. I like always to go to core of the problem. it might sound it's a bit general, but I think we are mostly of what we are now focusing in the European countries, and I know that we are in this kind of topics we are focusing on because I live in Finland. We focus on the result of lack of justice or inequality. We lack hope of life in Middle East. We lack basic human needs. As he said, I've been in the refugee camp of Zatari. I have seen what it does to 160,000 people when you put them into this, categorized into these fences. People who are very smart, very intelligent, very from different various backgrounds. When you strip them out of these basic human rights and needs, you will create a person, a radical. And I think that's one important issue also, that the European Union should know what is happening in their refugee camps. And also the idea that when people lack security and people who are in power of deciding for others and having the lack of democracy, having, for example, now Syrians, I think Syrians in their own country should, just as we Palestinians, we should have the right democratically to choose what is good for us and live democratically, and not have powers who decide what is the benefit of these people, because usually these powers also keep up such leaders, such as Assad, that are actually they are mass murderers, and buying time for them by involving these external powers coming to these grounds. And in the end, what we have in the end is still, the killer is still there. And actually what I see is now we're going to have the killer in power because of external powers want them to be there. So I think that's one of the basic ideas that we should differ. And now, the last point what I would like is how people perceive us as Arabs, especially Muslims, because I think many of you forget that we have Jewish Arabs, we have Christian Arabs, and we all face the same struggles in our common ground. It's not only one people, and it's not only one people who are radicals, and it should be people, when they have a name for something, it doesn't mean that they know what are they talking about, because I understand that it's easier for people to categorize or stereotype some group of people, so you, it would be easier to communicate or deal with them when you supposedly know his backgrounds and how do you would you deal with him, for example. And even if I speak 5 languages, it doesn't mean that I understand these cultures that there's language, because as we know, even here in Britain and in Finland, we have different, even inside the cultures and these cultures, how always culture is the more powerful one, not the religion. And you should remember that, because these powers keep up certain cultures based on biology, like these institutional laws that, for example, in Saudi Arabia, these women, they cannot drive. We have the rules for social origin, because you come from this culture and how do you do this religion? And what also you should remember that Islam, there is only one Islam. And I think most of the Western people forget that. Do you think that there are different Islams? No, it's only one. And also the personal interest and paths that individuals choose, even if they come from certain groups, always they are in the end individuals. I think I'll use my time there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ahmad.
So yeah, going back to reflect on the industry of radicalization, I just want to mention a point of who actually starts it, who builds this radicalization or forms the idea of radicalization. It could be, the loss of faith into the governments or the representatives, which is actually the case, I may say, the case in the Arab region. People lost faith in their governments, people lost faith in those who should represent them, so they were seeking other alternative methods in order to be heard or in order to find their rights. Another very interesting point is that sometimes totalitarian regimes really are in favor for such radical voices because it would be much easier for them to gain legitimacy so that they can actually export a picture to the outer world, that this is the vacuum that we're going to have. It's either us or these radical voices. And on the other side, it creates this culture of fear among the people who are living in the country itself, so that people also would not have this, again, kind of choice. And this leaves the people, if I may say, again, in the Arab region, or if I may reflect also on the Western Muslims, with this loss of belonging, if I may say, loss of faith, again, which could also be as a result of, like in the Western countries, misrepresentations in the media. I would say, there is a lot of misrepresentation for Muslims in the Western media, which is actually having its own effects and influence on the people's understandings and ideas about Muslims themselves. I just read an article, a very sad article yesterday about a woman who called two veiled women on the bus to go back to where you come from, you ISIS people, just because they were wearing veil. Although they were British citizens and they were just on the bus, happened to be on the bus with the same lady. Such things may actually push, according to some scholars, may push people to feel this loss of belonging to the community, lack of integration into it. So they seek other methods. So maybe, log online and try to read about these communities which can actually be more welcoming for us, for our beliefs, especially if we are risen according to different culture and believing into something that is not very well going with that. I would use a personal experience. For example, I come from Egypt. I've been risen in a very different culture, so when I go out with friends, sometimes I don't drink because I'm Muslim, and this makes me feel a bit like, everybody feels like an alien. Oh, we never drink and stuff. And on the other side, I'm not also veiled. I do not have something to show that I'm a Muslim, so I don't also feel much belonging to other groups or Muslim groups. So this kind of loss of belonging between two different parties could be the inner struggle inside each Muslim, maybe here in the West. I would also like to reflect on another point, could be a cause for such drifting towards such groups, radical groups, which could be the proper understanding of the text, of their causes, and of actually what they believe in. I think reading the Quran and knowing a bit about what it calls for reading, it calls for education, it calls for making people's minds and forming their own opinion about what they see, not to take things from leaders, not to take things just from the sources without making up their own mind about the issues, which I think is a very important thing, not to fall as prey for other radical voices which are very much available and developed and have much access to the internet.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. Actually, I'm not going to pretend that I know why young people turn radicalized or join radical groups. So I'm not going to add more reasons to the reasons that my colleague just mentioned to you about their views of why young people could turn into radicalized group or into extreme groups. But I think that there are different reasons for people in the East and the West to become radicalized, and I don't think it's the same reason that drive everybody into that direction. But what I'm convinced of is that this is a gradual process. I don't think this happens within a day and a night. They realize that I don't find my situation in the society, my position in the society. I reject the values of my community or my society, and I reject the current system. So let's I'm going to become radical. I think there is a space, there is a time elapsed between this realization that I don't fit, that I don't realize what my situation in the society is, and between deciding on the action that they're going to take. Some of the actions are actually channeling their creativity into a positive thing, entrepreneurship, and trying to kind of find things to change the status quo, working within the system and working collaboratively in a positive way. Or it could be, unfortunately, in some instances, going in a negative way, or joining a kind of a radical group that is exclusive, or that is joining a militia, or fighting somewhere. And I think what we can do is that we can focus on this space, on this time between the realization and the action, and try to neutralize the factors that could create an enabling environment for recruiting young people into, for example, joining ISIS. And I think that we need to understand that for a young person, whether in the East or in the West, I mean specifically in the Middle East, because I'm from Syria, I can probably talk a bit with more certainty about it, is that for a young person to say no to radicalization, they should be also able to say no to quite a lot of things. They should be able to say no to money incentives. So economics is actually an important factor. A young father in Syria, for example, in a besieged area, no jobs, no prospect, war, and, for example, finding his kids starving. And then how could he say no to this man who would come and say, take $300 a month, but just grow a beard, hold a gun, and stay there? Most probably, if he doesn't want his kids to be, dying out of starvation, he might accept. So it's not out of ideology. There are economic reasons that should be considered. Young people should be able to say no at home and at schools growing up. The education system is actually encouraging oppression, no critical thinking, taking any information at face value without even criticizing, without even discussing. So how can they say no to a preacher or to somebody who's actually filling their heads with wrong ideas? I remember that, for example, teachers and schools in the Middle East, they would penalize the student for solving the quiz in a different way, even if it reaches the same conclusion, but because it's not the way that the teacher, that she or he said, and taught the kids, they would be penalized for it. So that actually encourages people just to take things at face value, not questioning anything, and they wouldn't be able to say no to a preacher. They also should be able to say no to oppression from the government. If they find that actually the government or the political system preventing them from getting their basic rights, which happens quite a lot in the Middle East, I think they should be able to have the skills and know how to do it in a peaceful, organized manner, so that they can fight for their rights in a civil and peaceful way, rather than joining an extremist group to do that. They also should be feeling accepted. I think the example of that Bruno started with about the kid in America, I mean, thanks God it got to the media and Obama invited him to the White House. Otherwise, he's actually pushing that kid into these extremist groups. He's actually casting them. Marginalization could actually trying to find a way to belong. So what I'm going to say is that while we explore the reasons of why people join radical group, let's focus on this time, this space between the realization and the action, and try to ensure that we're not creating an enabling environment. Thank you.
There's just a couple of little things I'd just like to ask our speakers about. Saja, you made a point that seems to me to be very interesting. You were saying that authoritarian regimes sometimes use the spectre, the demon of radicalism or radicalization to seek support in the West. And I guess Sisi might be a good example about that. Do you want to illuminate that, the uses and abuses of the demon of radicalization?
Yeah, there is no doubt that Egypt now is facing a wave of violence in Sinai. There are a lot of question marks regarding what is actually going on. When I gave the example, actually, I meant more like in Syria, for example. Like what has been going on in Syria started as a revolution. People who really wanted to call for the rights and wanted to have them. And at the end now, Al-Assad is just trying to show that either ISIS groups or even me, there is like as if no presence for these liberal voices who actually started it.
The scenario possibly is Russia helps Assad to be dominant, and then Assad goes to the West and says it's me or ISIS.
Yeah, actually, and this was very evident regarding the first airstrikes that have been done in Syria. Russian airstrikes, they have been actually directed to the camps of the Syrian revolutionaries. It has not been directed, like 5%, if I may say, of the airstrikes have been directed to ISIS, while the rest have been directed towards the opposition to al-Assad, like the first ones, who are not radical, who are not extremists, and who were really supporting just the revolution from the beginning.
Okay, thank you. Ahmad, you were talking about the way in which refugees are treated, and it's a big issue at the moment. And I'm quite interested in that because, on one level, this idea of welcome for refugees is seen as something very positive, but at the same time, the people who are refugees are often kept in reception centres that will probably become more and more like a detention facility over the next period of time. People often aren't allowed to work and participate fully in a society via work and being able to make money and make a better life. So I was just wondering if you could develop that a little bit more in terms of what kind of experiences and stories and accounts that perhaps you've heard that made you say that you were worried about that.
Okay, I'll start with the society who, obviously, there are the major population who is taking care of these refugee camps. There are original Jordanians and lots of Chechenians. It's a big minority in Jordan, and they are taking care of it. And I believe that most of them, not all of them, there is a huge gap of corruption going on there, and it's a fact. And the Europeans know there is a gap, and there's a corruption happening. The problem is that there is nothing done to the corruption, and why does this corruption go on and nothing is done? Because I think this comes back again to the same thing as we have now Saudi Arabia and many other countries that are great allies of some Western countries, and even the greatest potato importer for UK. You probably are eating their chips today even, I think. Think about these countries. How many of these Gulf Arabic countries have taken the refugees? None of them. And I think also the same thing is, the problem is when you have these leaders that are backed up by relations, economical, political relations, the very same governments are causing this fear to their countries. The fear in Middle East is huge. It's much bigger, for example, than in Finland. Finland, we do have also the very same fear among the societies or the groups of neo-Nazis. You probably have heard about Breivik in Norway, and now the neo-Nazis who just, they stabbed a person, a Finnish person. It goes Finns against Finns, Norwegians against Norwegians. And the very same fear that they're coming, this huge group, that already these peoples only thing that the Jordanians are now thinking is, how do I get my food to the table? How do I get clothes and worth to my children? And when this is an essential question, and let's say now they put in media, for example, yes, next month we're going to raise up the price of the gas. Everybody go crazy and they forget all the injustices happening. Next day they discuss about the price of the gas. Again, they're all terrified what will happen to the next day. And then again, they all forget the essence of the whole problem, which is the lack of justice.
Can I build on that, actually?
Yes, because I'm going to come back to you on the injustice thing. But presumably as well, Ahmed, is if you identify Muslims and Muslim refugees as being perhaps a source of danger,
I don't want to put them into Muslim.
Are you going to feed that fear as well? I'm not saying that you do it, but I'm saying by societies being concerned about radicalisation, do they feed that fear?
No, now we're talking about Islam again. No, I think this is not an Islamic question, just as Palestinian question is not Islamic question. It's about basic human rights question that is not provided for these people. And it's not about Islam, it's about fear that is created to the people and constant fear that is being held on the people. And that's why these people, when some group of people come here, or for example now media sells an article because certain words sell well, like jihadism. And for example, now we have motorcyclists going to fight with the Kurdish people, but there are 5 different Kurdish groups, which one of them they fight with, and then the Kurdish peoples themselves, when they go to fight, why are they then jihadists? Because they're Muslim, they might not be even Muslim.
The question of inequality and injustice, because one of the things that we probably all know is that once you yourself or you perceive an inequality or an injustice, it makes you question things, doesn't it? And presumably it should make us question things. So when you talk about injustice and inequality, isn't it a good thing if we question?
That's a good question, but
okay.
But I will answer in a different way because
Okay.
I really want to build on the point that Ahmad just made, and it's a very important point. I think you were trying to perhaps put together, and maybe I'm rephrasing, but this is what I got from what you're saying about fear being the knot of radicalization. Like if we break together fear and break it down, and the knot of it would be fear. But also the way we have been fighting radicalization is characterized by fear and is propagating fear. Now, how can we take people away from fear when our way of responding to their own fear is by drones, by policing, by putting more people in jail, and by having more exclusion? So I think it's very important that we recognize radicalization as a two-way, process where you have people who are fearing injustice and fearing inequality and fearing being not belonging to society and fearing not being able to, feed their children. But at the same time, they're now fearing the response, which is, war in countries, in many countries in our region, as a response as a fight to radicalization, but also within the home, like for instance the UK. Measures of policing and measures of censorship and measures where now some artists can be considered terrorists just because they express a different view, or organizations having to be monitored all the time for the work that they're doing. So it's a very important point because it shows us that in all the responses that we had in fighting radicalization, or at least the popular ones, not only they were all based on fear, but none of them were about listening to radical groups. None of them were about understanding what these radical groups were, and none of them were about offering alternatives to these radical groups. We are not offering hope, we are not offering alternative, and we are not offering platforms where people who are being radicalized can perform their views and ideas in a different way that is not as violent and not as dangerous.
Yes, so that seems to be a very important point, that actually a lot of this debate and preoccupation and fear of radicalization results in shutting things down. It results in a view that says you have to follow the rules and these are the rules.
And coming from a country that faced dictatorship, I'm telling you, there has been nothing easier than policing and then censoring at the time before the Arab Spring. In Tunisia, we never heard of radicalization, not because it didn't exist, but because it was never allowed to be expressed in any way, and that only allowed people to be even more radicalized and even more cornered and even more excluded, and take their expressions of radicalization further and bring in more people with that dictatorship and with that oppression, with that policing.
Yes.
So we need to learn from these lessons instead of reproducing the same measures and the same strategies.
Okay, just Anas, I'll come back to you, Saja, in a second. But Anas, you were talking, I thought you made an interesting point about the questioning that often results from our search for belonging, our search for community, and perhaps our sense of inequality. That creates a space, it's a process, it's a journey. It's not it's not like we're sort of robots and we download jihadi website and become a suicide bomber. It's about a space, it's a journey, it's open-ended. So would you agree with Samar that having a very sort of authoritarian response to this that says you can't think that, you can't question that, these are the values, you must tick all the boxes. Do you agree that shuts down the space and has the potential of pushing people?
Yeah, definitely. I think they feed on each other. I think authoritarian kind of regimes find a good enemy in radicalization. They say either us or them. So in a way, they kind of benefit from having radicalized group. because that kind of negates the alternative, negates the third option, which is kind of a normal community, civil society organizations, kind of people getting along, trying to make a living. So I think they kind of are frenemies. They feed on each other. And I think they fight them, but not to the extent to exterminate them. They want to keep them a bit and, have these nuances and use it as a weapon, to kind of to say, look at these population in the Middle East. They are, a bunch of terrorists. If you don't have us, yes, we're dictators, fascists, whatever, but it's much better than having, these...
Saja, you wanted to come back, and then I'm going to take it out to the audience.
Yeah, well, I was going to comment on your question about this fear thing, that the West is like fearing this radical voices. I just want to note to a very interesting point I just read, that every week, like 5 British citizens are likely to join ISIS. So it's now, I think the fear is moving, like not from the West, from the radicalization that is coming from the Arab countries. I think it's now the time where Arab countries are a bit concerned about the radicalization that is being exported from the West.
Okay, that's a really good one to leave us with, because it does very much seem, in Belgium particularly, which has the highest number of so-called foreign fighters, is the amount to which this has been exported from Western countries to the region. I want to come out to the audience.
Well, I think you're all very interesting individuals, but that's the problem. You're individuals, and I don't detect a great sense of common identity or collective purpose. So, I mean, to pick one of many examples of how you've all in various ways revealed that you've got fairly fragile identities, well, let's just go back to where you come from, to the 2 women on the bus. Now, I remember when I was young and marginally militant, I was told to go and live in Moscow if I didn't like it here. But that didn't give me a sense of grievance, it didn't create in me a sense of loss. It meant that I wanted to become more militant, more mediated, more convincing. And, the examples I've heard from you beg the question, you all seem to be living isolated individual lives, and as isolated individuals, you're unable to change things. You are an expression of the culture of fear. Sorry.
Thank you.
The question is to Ahmad because he has a European experience, but it's for everyone sort of in relation to Europe versus the Arab world. And I think the new mutation in radicalization or people joining ISIS is not because they want to go and fight. It's because they want to live in what they think is an Islamic nirvana. They take their kids, their schoolgirls, they're barely outside of their teens. And they don't want to go and do the jihadi thing that has been glamorized by years in Chechnya, Kosovo, those types of things. They want to set up a life there because they think it's the only place they can live as good Muslims, because they've been brought up in a world where they have every freedom. They are middle-class Muslim kids who are educated, whose parents did the best for them. They're third-generation immigrants. And actually, they reject all of that because they want a life of rules and they want lives without temptation. They don't want to see naked women on the streets when they go out. They don't want to be surrounded by boys giving them attention. They want to live the perfect Muslim life. And it has an almost millenarian bent to it because they think that the end of times is coming, and that's why it's important to be in the place where only true Islam can exist. Is this radicalization? Or is this Muslims having existential, really the germ of what it is to be a Muslim in this world? Do you still categorize this phenomenon, which is a phenomenon which is quite new and people don't really understand, still as radicalization in the same way that you talk about socioeconomic struggles of Arab people in the Arab world or fighting against
conformity? Can I just ask
conformity?
you a question? But surely a big part of the relationship must be how Muslims are themselves seen in the West. So it's a two-way street, isn't it? Perhaps some of these guys who go off to Raqqa or wherever it is do want to live a pure Muslim life, but presumably some of the discussion and some of the process is about how they are viewed as well in Western society.
I think there's a difference. I don't think Muslims who go out and do it look at themselves as victims anymore. I don't think they self-victimize themselves. I don't think that they are done wrong by the state. They don't want to stay in Britain to set up a Sharia state. It's not Hizb ut-Tahrir anymore that is on our streets. It's kids who think that the only way that they can do what Allah wants is for them to get out of this society and set up their own society. I think they are empowered a lot by social media. I don't think that they cry about the fact that they are victims of Islamophobia.
Okay, thank you.
I think following on from that, what probably follows and what we've heard is that actually there are a lot of reasons behind radicalisation. But one thing that a lot of people on the panel picked up on was economic and social problems and a lack of economic and social rights for people in Arab countries. So then the question that follows for me is, to what extent in the UK is it our responsibility to do something about that, and should we try to do something about that? Because does that lead us down a path towards imperialism? Obviously there's a much more complicated problem now in Syria over the extent to which we should intervene in the conflict there. But in all countries, to what extent should we be trying to impose our own way of improving these problems that can lead to radicalisation?
I wanted to pick up on a point that you, the chair, made earlier at the beginning of the debate, which was about, are all radical groups bad? And I think it's important to remember that a radical group isn't necessarily a bad or violent group, and that a lot of radical groups have been the forefronts of moving our society to more liberal-minded and open-minded ways of living. The suffragettes, they were considered the most radical people at the time. You know, the notion that a woman could have a logical, reasonable thought was considered completely radical. And I think that actually is perhaps more the environments that which these groups find themselves in, and the way that they treated by the rest of society that might actually cause them to become violent, or whether actually radical groups can be a really good and progressive part of our society.
Okay.
If I may, it sounds as though we are all coming dangerously close to forming some kind of apologetic for radical groups. So I totally agree. Not all radical groups are bad. However, if the kind of hatred that's espoused by Daesh and Hizb ut-Tahrir are referred to in 100 years' time as being progressive and the course of history, I will be grateful for being dead. Quite simply. I think the kind of... thank you. I think the kind of alarmism at, for instance, the Prevent initiatives and kinds of things that we're talking about, I think the fact that we are focusing exclusively on Islam is in fact propagating a lot of the narratives we're talking about. I am grateful that the government's sort of watch list or the government's issues does include extreme right-wing groups, groups like Britain First, groups like the EDL, groups that espouse values that they claim to be British, that I feel angry about, because I do not identify that as part of my identity. I think what we're talking about far more broadly is contested identities within a social space that's becoming more and more ambiguous, and it's harder and harder for us to articulate ourselves in, rather than necessarily anything to do with specific cultures or specific identities.
Okay, that's a good point.
Hi, I just have a short question, actually related to what that gentleman said there. It's about the promotion of British values in schools. So teachers are recently being asked more to actively promote British values to their students. I just wondered what you think of this. Do you think this will help young people feel like they fit in more? Or do you think it will just alienate those who already feel like they don't fit in? So is it sort of implying that British values are more important than the values of other cultures?
Can I ask you a question? What do you think, and what do you think British values are? So I had a primary school boy from Birmingham on Radio 4, I think it was earlier this week, and he said that he'd been taught that equality before the law meant that everybody has to obey the rules, and if you don't obey the rules, anybody or everyone will then be arrested, and he was saying that's a British value. And perhaps it is. So what do you think? What do you think? It's a good question, but...
From my understanding, the three main things we've been told to promote, as a teacher myself, are the rule of law, which should be obeyed, but also democracy and tolerance of difference. But the last two particularly, I don't feel like they're necessarily British, like uniquely British. Surely tolerance of difference is something that would be present in many cultures. And I'm not sure that putting the label of British on these values is that helpful, rather than calling them universal values that we can all relate to.
Okay, right. I want to bring the panel back. You can come in on what you want to come in on. Just throw out a few things. You're all a bit lonely and isolated, apparently. Should our concern about injustice in parts of the world like Syria lead the Western powers to get involved, external powers to get involved. What are British values? Surely some ideas are perhaps universal. And, you know, ISIS are bad, so something should be done. So any of these issues or more that you want to come back on? Who wants to go first?
I'm pretty sure I can answer the first two questions. First, we're telling where identities are weak. I think it's a European thing to have this banal nationalist ideology of what is a nation, what is a culture. Let's crystallize culture. And then you start bringing things that are very, very British, or these are very Finnish, like Sisu, or you might know Finland, maybe you don't. But these things, in the end, culture is not like a thing and another totally abstract of each other. And you probably know the history of Britain, it's not very lonely in the end. How many nations and cultures have visited and left their mark in Britain. So they're saying that my identity is quite fragile, or it would be. But I think you should be looking more about people's experience and how people do experience now this radicalization. And when we come from different experiences and like backgrounds with different experiences, we identify different things as radicalization. And how should we resist radicalization in our nations when we are being forced into things that are unhuman? And then European countries, I think the idea of the fear of people, when people have left their countries, maybe somebody might have heard, when the person leaves the valley, but the valley doesn't leave the man. So it's a big process that the person needs to go to re-identify him as in this new nation or in these new cultural values. And I think it's very important, and I think it's very possible.
Okay, thank you. Oh no, actually, I want to ask you something, because the gentleman there said that the sort of talk of inequality was an apologetic for ISIS, and you were saying that, you know, there's a root here of people, you know, questioning injustice.
Yeah, I know you want me to answer the question on inequality, but I won't at the moment, because first...
Well, how about the question that's apologetic?
I will actually
Okay.
end with a comment on that. But before, I want to answer the individual who said we are individuals. And first, really thank him, because he gave us an opportunity to perhaps shed some light on what brought us together and what connects us to each other. And it might look that we are individuals sitting in a panel, but really these people, they're leaders. They are gathering people together to believe in social change and action. And what brought us together was this program, Young Arab Voices, through which we were able to train thousands of young people in the Arab region on debate skills. And what we've been trying to do for the last 4 years with this program, this is just one program out of many that, you know, some of the panelists here are contributing to and involved in. What it allowed us to do is train young people who felt alienated, who felt excluded, or sometimes felt that they can only speak by raising their voices up, but not necessarily by having critical thinking and creative thinking. We made them feel the power of arguments, the power of debate that is put in a format where you can accept different opinions, where you have a time slot that you can't speak for more than that, where you have to base your ideas on facts and research. And I think this is very empowering, because it takes us away from our individual experiences to bring together people who can also benefit from the sort of training that we were benefiting from. And that is, if any, the action and the support that people perhaps in the West who feel they want to feel engaged, just to answer the question here, can bring. Not their own solution of problems, because truth is, you know, the West is also having lots of problems, socio-economic problems that hasn't been solved yet. If anything, we don't want these solutions to be imposed. What we want is the things that are working already in our context to be empowered and multiplied.
Leave it there, because that's
okay.
So crystal clear.
Okay.
That just leave, because that's a really
What
good
about the
point.
inequality one?
Well, come back to it. There's lots of time. There's lots of time.
Yeah,
well,
just,
a fair bit of time.
Again, just on the first question, I think that collective identity in the Arab world is a myth. And that's why this program is called Young Arab Voices, not Young Arab Voice, because there's no one voice and there is no one Arab identity. And again, there's no one ethnicity in the Arab world. This is voices, and we are trying kind of to shed light on different experiences from different countries. I think to the question mentioned that should the West try to do something, I think many of the Syrians didn't want any intervention, I think, especially at the beginning. But I think when you get to the point when half of the population are either refugees or internally displaced, I think it's hard not to. But the problem then, to which side, and it's never going to please anyone. So I think it's a very, very complicated question, and there's no easy solution to it.
Leave it there, because that's good.
Okay.
Saja, come in with what you like, because I want to get another load of audience in, and you're going to have a chance to conclude with a really important point.
Okay, yeah. Well, I just had one last thing regarding the first statement. I don't think I got the question in the first question, but about regarding the two ladies on the bus and the tendency of the honorable speaker to go back to Russia, like on vacations and stuff. What if these Muslim people who happen to be on the bus and happen to be also veiled do not belong anywhere else? They just belong to the UK, and they're just native British who became Muslims or believed in that thing. I would love to know what you think about that. Where should they go back to feel this sense of belonging? Because they belong here. And I wanted to comment on the last question about the British norms. I'm not, my experience with the British norms is very limited because I've been living here for only limited time. However, I do not see any kind of contradiction between living among different cultures. I mean, in Islamic studies itself, it calls for people to go through the earth, to travel, to learn, to meet different people, to accept everyone, to accept all the differences. So I don't see any kind of problem or battle between this and that.
Okay, audience game, and I'm still keen to think about this idea of British values, Western values, full stop.
Do you think it's a form of post-colonialism and therefore a bad thing to suggest that Western ideas like human rights should become universal ideas?
That's a good question that gets to the nub of it. So yes, it's all imperialism. Yeah.
Like you, Bruno, I'm a bit uncomfortable with the idea that radicalisation per se, or being radical per se, is a bad thing. And I felt that the panel was sort of counterposing the radical versus the alternative being something like be more patient, be more gradualist, be more moderate, work within the system. Is there any other way to oppose, not radicalism in general, but the particular content of the radicalism that we're talking about, the kind of radicalism of ISIS, which is not a problem just because it's radical, it's the content of the radical politics which is the real kind of nub of the issue. And I also would really be curious to know what the panel make of, I mean, we've talked a lot about belonging and identity and so forth in a kind of European context, and the portrayal of Muslims in the media and so forth. I'm very curious to know what the panel make of official attempts to not do that, to be friendly, to be welcoming, to say things like explicitly for the last 10 years more, we're not at war with Islam. This is not a clash of civilizations. I'm reading the Quran. I would, what do you think of that? Is that hypocrisy? Is that clumsiness?
Okay, I just do have to note that actually people on this panel didn't really talk about identity. They talked about the quest for a sense of belonging and meaning in society, and the questions raised by inequalities and injustices that one do exist, or sometimes may be perceived to exist, and that's something actually that is pretty universal as well. So I don't necessarily think. Let's remember that most people on the panel haven't really mentioned or talked about identity. That seems to be something that is sort of thrown onto it.
I struggle with the idea that the loss of belonging and the absence of having the basic human provisions being provided for, that this leads to radicalization. I just can't see the link there. To me, for somebody to join a group like ISIS, it sounds like they join from a very deep conviction. There needs to be a deep conviction, I think, to join a group like ISIS. So if that's the case, it's not a case of losing belonging, but it's rather a deep conviction. And I wonder what is going on in our society that people decide to join groups like ISIS rather than, for example, follow liberalism or humanism. Is there something else going on in society?
Okay, that's good. And next person, please.
Clearly, well, maybe not clearly, I'm an Arab, but I've been living here 33 years. When I was growing up, being an Arab did not mean necessarily being a Muslim. How frustrating is it for you to actually, because I grew up in a Catholic convent school in Lebanon. I was a Muslim, but the religion was just a minor thing that the nuns and my grandma did. So how frustrating is it for you that it's synonymous now, Arab with Islam, especially that it alienates so many other groups within the Arab world who are actually very progressive. The other thing is just a comment. We have ISIS in Lebanon, and they are actually killing people and doing nasty things. In Lebanon, when I talk to really poor people who are Sunnis, unfortunately, they do apologize for ISIS because they feel disempowered. So there is difference between people how they see ISIS here and the complex politics of the Middle East that actually gives rise to people supporting ISIS.
Okay, thank you here.
Yes, this term, radicalisation. Being radical means getting to the roots of things. Surely that's a good thing. So I don't understand why it's being used as a sort of baddie word. But also, what kind of people go off and take action, calling themselves jihadi, whatever? I do know of a certain boy, Jihadi John, actually, what his background was. He was a street gang boy here. That's what he was. Goes off somewhere else, gets himself on television, killing people.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I've got two things to say, both to Mr. Hamad. You said that no Gulf countries have taken in any refugees, but that's not true. Saudi Arabia alone has taken 2.5 million Syrian citizens, so it's excluding all the refugees from other countries and excluding...
That's not right.
That's not right.
This is not right.
Anyway, come on, carry on.
So you said there's only one form of Islam. Well, I disagree, and I believe that everyone has their own perception of Islam based on their experiences of Islam.
Okay, thank you. And this is the last point from the audience here.
It was just a thought on teaching British values in school. Would it not, and stressing the differences and that those are respected within the UK, would it not make more sense to teach the values of different religions, for example, Islam, Christianity, and other ones, and stress the commonalities in the sense that the values in those religions are very much the same? And I lived in Syria before the war as well, and there was a complete understanding that Muslim and Christian values were exactly the same and did not lead to things like in Eastern Europe, people saying we're happy to accept Christian refugees but not Muslim refugees. Some people say.
Okay, we're going to come back and ask Saja, Ahmad and Samar.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the question about frustration. I mean, I'm not religious. I come from an interfaith extended family, and one of my parents is atheist. I'm not going to say who it is. So thank you very much for that. It feels really that sometimes you need to be apologetic, just because being an Arab, that you need to always justify that, it's really, like it's not us, and it's sorry, and it's, whereas this is like I think it's a human-wide problem, and it's really multifaceted. Again, as I said at the beginning, there's no one reason, there is no one set of reasons. Each country, each civilization has to understand what's happening within their structures that actually pushing people to the extreme rather than to begin, to work within the center. And whether radical is a good or bad thing, but we're talking here in the context of being kind of violence and extremism. I think ISIS comes to mind whenever we think. And just very quickly, Saudi Arabia didn't take 2.5 million Syrian refugees. There are a lot of Syrians who work in Saudi Arabia for 30, 40 years, and they're quite affluent, but they didn't take any refugees, unfortunately. And even finally, I'm just going to say something that I think when we talk about resisting radicalization, again in the form of ISIS, I think us in the Arab world, in the Middle East, we are probably the ones that have the highest interest in combating this and resisting this, because I think not only made us in an apologetic and always kind of question and suspicious, and we need to kind of justify ourselves. In terms of casualties, in terms of economics, I think this part of the world kind of has suffered mostly out of radicalization and terrorism. So I think we have the highest interest in combating that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your comment about being raised in a Catholic church, because I had the same almost way of growing up. I grew in a church, like in a school that it was a church. And coming back to the last question about like accepting Christian refugees or Muslim refugees, also thank you, because you mentioned that in the Arab region there has never been this kind of much differences between people's beliefs. People could be Muslim, could be Christian, could be non-believer, could be an atheist, and it was not much of a problem until very much recently. If I want to conclude, I would really love that we not only have to talk about the concept, because now we've been speaking for almost an hour and we could not reach a rigid definition for radicalization and where it come from and how to to trace it. But we can actually try to find alternative ways for people who seek these forms of action to enforce on other groups. What we can actually do, or what we should actually do, is that we try to find alternative methods to prevent such people from joining this way of thinking, to presenting for example, helping the initiatives that are working on representing or showing the real meanings of Islam or Christianity or Judaism, because extremism exists everywhere. And try to offer that alternative to be that easy for people who feel this emotional contact. If they want to help people in Syria or Iraq, they should find other alternative methods to help them instead of just going there and fight. Thank you.
Well, in the end, I would like to say it's the lack of coherent response to ideological societal pressure, just as we had in Germany. The churches, they promoted social nationalism. Now we don't have in Islamic world, we do not have a coherency. We even have really crazy priests. Even, for example, the head of the priests in Egypt say that after the prophet comes Sisi. First God gave us a prophet, then he gave us Sisi. I think it's quite hilarious too. These are paving ways for radicalization, and I think when a person, a refugee, comes to the country, I think the system, the best way to get them into the society is to require them to work hard, because working hard to get into the society is the best way of getting the experience of the country where they are in. Meaning, what is even let's say the culture or nationalist idea, I say banal nationalism, but it's not that bad word, but as long as it's not going to the extent of people understanding that it's something that to be feared of, that cultures change, that cultures will change, and people are afraid of this change. I clap for her, because she mentioned that these people who are in the NP behind this they have these criminal records. I think if you look at all the criminal records of these people who have the history of these people who are doing these physical crimes in Europe, they have, especially the neo-Nazis, they have background in being in jail for other crimes also, especially physical crimes. And in Europe, physical crime is less bad than stealing money from the government, unless you have noticed. And also the same thing in Jordan, and I have seen it in my own eyes, guys who have this high beard have tattoos on their feet saying you are all dogs. And they use drugs, they use a lot of other things. So these are the people, the core people of this ISIS and these radical groups that you guys are seeing right now in the media.
On the radical, not all radicals are bad. I think, for me, it only starts to be bad when we are not accepting others, when we are trying to eliminate them and eliminate their views. So the bad radical for me is the sport fan who wouldn't allow fans from other clubs to enter the train. The bad radical for me is the one who wouldn't allow different views to be expressed. And it's very important to make that distinction between a radical group that would allow some space of freedom of speech and one that would simply eliminate the others. And on the human rights question, it's a very good question. What worries me more than the post-colonialism in it is the fact that even if we take human rights as universal, being conceived by Western societies, it seems that these very Western societies that have voiced them out or lip-served them have identified some people to be humane and have rights and others not to. And you have people here in the UK, let alone in other places, who have more rights than others. You have people who have right to shelter when they arrive to Europe because they are Christians or because they have some sort of skills, and other people who do not have that right to shelter. You have now people today who have the right to live and others who don't, based simply on skin color. And this leads me to my final point about inequality, which I should answer. And when we talk about Arabs or Muslims having to apologize when, you know, ISIS is doing an operation, but then white people not having to apologize when a white criminal is killing black people in the US with a gun. This shows that not only we are not treating the roots of problems and the causes of problems, we are only concerned with the symptoms, but even our response to these systems, we are propagating again the same roots of the problems, which are again the inequality. So it's very important to see that even in our responses to inequality, we are being unequal. And the violence and the extremism and the bad radicalization will continue until the day injustice and inequality starts to end.
Okay, thanks to the panel.